can I ask you, Niromi, about the process of writing the book? What was it like to write the book? When did you write it? And why is it published now?
Well, funnily enough, I wrote this soon after I left the Tigress. So when I was in a boarding school in India with the Irish nuns, the only way to let yourself be, free is to just write down your thoughts. And for me, especially have come from such a horrible few years and suddenly be put into this environment where it was a very controlled, very posh boarding school, I had to sort of I felt like I had all these memories that not many people could relate to. I did tell my friends then, but, they didn't understand. They were just 15-year-old girls who were bewildered, And I also felt a sense of responsibility for those people that had died, especially my friend. I felt like I knew her last days, her last hour, and I'm the one who has to put it all down so that it's not forgotten. And I must say, I just would write every night in Tamil. That's my first language. So I wrote like a mad woman. And it really helped me at the end, because when I finished it, I just felt this sense of relief just overcome me, because I felt like, okay, it's there now. So I'm not going to forget, and you won't believe I had written down in so much detail. It's funny, that young you have a great memory. I don't now. But so I've written down things like what people said verbatim, what they wore, how they look like, that sort of detail. And then I put it away for 20 years, didn't look at it. I mean, my family wouldn't even really discuss any of these things. In Sri Lankan families, we are better not discuss things, because you've got to focus on the next thing. So, so I put it away. But in that whole time that I didn't read anything about Sri Lanka, I didn't want to know about Sri Lanka. I knew even the Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi was murdered at that time, supposedly by the Tigress, and that's all I knew. I didn't know who it was, what they did, nothing like that. And it's only in 2009 when the war was, like you read in Francis' book, that the refugees started coming to Australia. There was so much misinformation. You couldn't avoid it after that. I couldn't sort of ignore it. And then I had to start reading about what was happening in Sri Lanka. And the refugees were coming here, and people had all of these stories about, these are not real refugees, send them back, go back to where they came from, that sort of thing. And I felt it's because nobody understood about Sri Lanka. Nobody connected to anyone in a personal level. And it's all the stuff that they read is in newspapers, which is very clinical, and also academic textbooks perhaps. But I thought people just need to hear somebody's personal story of why they joined a movement like that, why they then fled their country and come to Australia. So events happened in such a way that I didn't go to a publisher. The publisher came to me and they said, can we put this book together? And I had to then translate it into English. And it was, honestly, for all that time, I hadn't felt the emotion of it. And it's only while I was translating, the whole thing just came back to me. And I started to process the whole thing. And you wouldn't believe, I'll be sitting at my keyboard and typing. My family would see me just bawling my eyes out, day in, day out. Because by that time, you knew what had happened after so many years of struggle, what the Tamils have come to. But in a way it was cathartic. It's funny, 2 years of writing the book and I still can't, you just relive it every time. And I understood what happened to people. And then I was looking for updates about what happened to the people that I left behind, because the guilt of having survived them is what made me feel terrible all these years. And everybody had died eventually, different, and you see it in the last chapter. So it was heartbreaking. And it took a lot of guts, because you read the book and you see everything. I've just poured my heart out to you. It was difficult, but it had to be done.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly raw book, I think. You've exposed your soul to the world to read, which, is incredibly courageous.
Or stupid.
Yeah, maybe.
The thin line between the
two. The connection between the 2009 arrival of asylum seekers, obviously that's been a lot of my work. Francis, I'm interested in your take on this. late last year, some senior opposition figures from Australia went to Sri Lanka on what they called a fact-finding mission. And they returned to Australia saying that the civil war was over, that the Sri Lankan government was not persecuting its citizens, and that Sri Lankans who arrived by boat should be basically turned around before they were able to access Australian law. Is the war over? Is it safe?
No. I mean, the war's not over. The fighting is over. I mean, the guns are silent, but none of the underlying root causes of this decades-long conflict have been addressed. In fact, if anything, things for Tamils in the north and the east have got worse, because much as there was this love-hate relationship with the Tigers, I mean, they loved them when they stood up for them, they hated them when they took their kids or their money, there's no buffer against the army now. The Tamils are just, it's completely one-sided. All the power lies with the army. So what we've seen since the end of the war is, apart from the actual end, there was a great deal of torture and summary execution and rape. But it wasn't that was just a sort of brief period of revenge at the end. That has continued to this day. So last week in London, I met a woman from Sri Lanka, an asylum seeker, who had been, her two younger brothers had been forcibly recruited by the Tigers. They disappeared. They went away hand in hand. They were so young. Her father was beaten to death, left in a ditch. She was put in prison and gang raped for several weeks. She came out. She went into hiding, and her mother said, "Don't come home, and they'll be looking for you." The next day, she got a phone call. They said, "Come back to the village. Your mother and sister are dead." She went back. She found their skeletons on a bed of ash. I mean, they burnt the whole house. She was so distraught she didn't hide. They picked her up. 47 days she was continuously beaten, starved, and gang raped, including with her head in a bucket of water. I mean, appalling treatment. Her mother's cousin, basically sold the land, bribed the police, got her out, took her across Sri Lanka, and popped her on a boat, much in the way that, decades earlier Niromi got on a boat to India. And she went in the boat still wearing the same clothes stained in blood and semen. It was appalling. And that's a girl sitting in London who's now suicidal. And this happened in November 2012. So if you tell her that the war is over, that's utter rubbish.
The fact-finding mission occurred in September.
Yeah, so this is at the same time, basically, this was going on. And it's going on again and again. Human Rights Watch recently issued a report about sexual abuse of men and women in Sri Lanka, and several of the cases were from last year. And, rape and sexual abuse is such a stigma, well, in any society, and especially in Tamil society, that if you can document eight cases from 2012 amongst asylum seekers, then that's the tip of the iceberg. We know that the army has increased in size. It's involved in every aspect of life. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights issued a report recently, because this is going to be discussed in Geneva, and she talked about how ordinary civilians in the north and the east who went through this war, don't even have the right to mourn. They cannot hold small gatherings, religious ceremonies to mourn the dead, and that is really the most basic of all things. And we're talking 4 years after a war in which tens of thousands of people died. Almost every family in the northeast would have lost somebody. And so not to allow them to mourn, to go to church or the temple and mourn, is so basic. I mean, that doesn't talk about a war being over or everything being fine and progress. The progress is infrastructure development. There's a lot of roads being built, and that's because it benefits, Sinhalese contractors, to be honest, and businesses from Colombo. Tamils are not benefiting from that.
And I think this whole thing about, not allowing mourning because my friend's grave was destroyed and army barracks was built right on top of it. It's sort of saying that, they don't acknowledge the fact that they are human beings. They fought a war and perished, but it's to erase everything that's about the Tigers. And I think, and also the unfortunate thing here is that all Tamils are seen as Tigers. There is no separate identity, even though some of them don't even agree with the Tigers. And yet it's seen as a collective identity, and because of that, the whole, so even if you mourn for your own relative, your family member who's died and had nothing to do with the Tigers, the fact that the act of mourning because they died during the war is seen as you're mourning for the Tigers. So that's part of the reason why I think they just don't allow it. That's denied.
Well, there's a total denial of what happened.
Yeah,
There's an erasing of history going on in the northeast. Erasing even the ancient history, discovering ancient Buddhist, sites, and using Sinhalese names for what is a Tamil area, settling Sinhalese people in the northeast, so there will be no Tamil concentration of population. There's some real kind of re-engineering of these areas going on at the moment, and that's quite disturbing. So to say that there's no reason for a person to flee, or to say that everything's improving in Sri Lanka, flies in the face of every single major international human rights organization's reports. I mean, you're talking about all of them, categorize detail what's happening and say that it's getting worse. The UN itself says that. The High Commissioner's report is very damning of what's happened in Sri Lanka. So if you talk about progress, it's progress in terms of building things. That's not about people's lives, and it doesn't benefit the people who survived the war at all.
Yeah, sure. Just before I open the floor to the audience, I just want to sort of step out from Sri Lanka and look at a bigger picture. Francis, you write that this story matters because Sri Lanka is no longer just a country whose people did bad things to each other. It's an unexpected piece of the jigsaw of the discourse on global terrorism. Can you talk about briefly about that?
Well, the Tigers were proscribed in many countries around the world, 40-odd countries, as a terrorist group. And the Sri Lankan government used that language of the global war on terror to win support. They said, okay, you've done it, and you've talked about, use the same sort of terminology in Iraq or Afghanistan. This is our war on terror, so you should support us, and you should turn a blind eye to what goes wrong. And they still say now that Sri Lanka is the only country in the world that has defeated terrorism militarily. I mean, that's a nonsense, obviously, because if you defeat it militarily and you don't address the reasons for an ethnic conflict, then you leave the problem festering. And if you also have this attitude of triumphalism and sort of lack of any kind of power sharing or concession at the end of the war, then you really set yourself up for a repeat of the war. And obviously that's a great concern, that in the decades to come, another generation may feel they need to take up arms again because there's nothing else for them. There's absolutely no other option. But yes, this language of terrorists and defeating terrorism was used. And the Sri Lankan state now exports its model. They call it the Sri Lankan option. So other countries have sent, and many of them, including Western countries, have sent delegates to this annual conference that the Sri Lankan military hold, where they teach military delegates, the lessons of counter-terrorism that they learned from this war. But this is the Sri Lankan option is really a method of scorched earth tactics, massive human rights violations, war crimes, crimes against humanity, failing to distinguish between civilians and combatants, bombing deliberately and repeatedly hospitals, bombing food queues, shelling concentrations of civilians. They've created no-fire zones where they said civilians should gather, and then they deliberately targeted those areas. And there are international witnesses to some of that happened in January 2009, UN people who were actually under fire, who were lucky to escape with their lives. So there are massive, massive violations of international law, which the UN experts who looked at this said basically posed a challenge to the entire regime of law, the way this war was fought. So there's an element to which, we as the international community, we in the world, ought to care about this, even if we don't care about Sri Lanka, which I do, of course, but even if you don't, you should be worried about it, because why do we have laws about war? If we can allow a country to breach all of them like this, then it sends a signal to other countries that, hey, you can do the same thing.
Sure. Yeah. I wonder if there's people in the audience who would like to ask our authors questions.